My name is Catherine Eleanor, and I am the Senior Global Legal Advisor for the International Foundation for Electoral Systems and Director of IFES's new Center for Anti-Corruption and Democratic Trust. 12 years ago this week, Sergei Magnitsky died in prison in Russia after investigating a corruption scheme. His death ultimately led to the passage of the Magnitsky Act in the US, allowing the US to place sanctions on corrupt human rights abusers in Russia and elsewhere. For me, Sergei's story illustrates three things. First, corruption is not a theoretical or abstract issue. It has a face. It is about people and it affects people. Secondly, corruption and injustice go together. And when it comes to kleptocracy, the injustice is not just related to the individual, but to the entire system of power in a country. The more unjust that system, the more corruption can flourish and ultimately turn into kleptocracy. And third, as a result, counter-kleptocracy and democracy protection efforts must also go together. We must do everything we can to protect our financial systems and our electoral systems from kleptocratic abuse. This is a big impetus behind the launch of our new center and why we have chosen the topic, taking on kleptocrats, for our inaugural event. We've also chosen this topic because despite what it seems, it is one of hope. Looking ahead to the Summit for Democracy in December, there are a lot of doomsday predictions about the future of democracy and a lot of grim statistics about the current state of democracy or lack of it around the world. There has also been an intense focus on the impact that the pandemic has had, both on democratic freedoms and on corruption. However, there are people everywhere around the world doing extraordinary things to prevent corruption and promote democracy. This webinar is a chance to share some of the advances and innovations in the United States with our international audience to help raise awareness of current momentum and future areas of focus for US policymakers. It's my pleasure to introduce the panelists that took part in our inaugural event. Paul Massaro is a Senior Policy Advisor for the US Helsinki Commission, responsible for OSCE's second dimension issues, or economic and environmental policy. Paul was a significant driver behind the establishment of the bipartisan Congressional Caucus Against Foreign Corruption and Kleptocracy. And if you want to learn everything about kleptocracy and how to fight it, I encourage you to follow Paul on Twitter. Gary Kalman directs the US Office of Transparency International, focusing particularly on illicit finance and the US role in global anti-corruption efforts. He was a founding member of the Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency, or FACT Coalition, a nonpartisan alliance promoting policies to combat corrupt financial practices, and was also a founder of Americans for Financial Reform, a coalition that in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis led to the successful fight for the Dodd-Frank financial reform bill. I would now like to pass over to IFES President and CEO, Tony Banbury, to provide some introductory remarks to our panel, Taking on Kleptocrats.
Hello and welcome to our audience from all around the world to the inaugural event hosted by IFES's new Center for Anti-Corruption and Democratic Trust. We launched this center 2 months ago to focus resources and attention on the foundational role that electoral and political corruption plays in wider governance and corruption issues. As we noted in the invitation to this event, corruption is a triple threat to democracies. It perpetuates unjust systems of power, it stunts the ability of governments to deliver, and it erodes trust in democratic institutions. At its worst, corruption breeds kleptocracy, clientelism, and state capture. And the link between corruption and authoritarianism has been explicitly acknowledged by the Biden administration. In autocracies, authoritarian leaders use elections to legitimize their hold on power. In functioning democracies, illicit political funding and spending can be used to influence and coerce voters. Once elected, corrupt politicians and their supporters have access to the power of government resources and other means of in-kind support to pay back supporters and gain an unfair advantage in future elections. In the US, President Biden has acknowledged that, I'm quoting here, the lack of transparency in our campaign finance system, combined with extensive foreign money laundering, creates a significant vulnerability. We need to close the loopholes that corrupt our democracy, unquote. Hence, two pillars of the forthcoming Democracy Summit hosted by the Biden administration focus on the twin challenges of corruption and authoritarianism. Looking ahead to that summit in just over 3 weeks, we thought it fitting to focus the inaugural event for IFES's new Center for Anti-Corruption and Democratic Trust on kleptocracy. Happily, this is one area where the United States is making progress and introducing legislative innovations to tackle the problem internationally, including the passing of the U.S. Corporate Transparency Act and the introduction of a slew of new draft legislation to counter corruption and kleptocracy, including the Establishing New Authorities for Business Laundering and Enabling Risk to Security Act, the Enablers Act, and the Combating Global Corruption Act, and the Countering Russian and Other Overseas Kleptocracy Act, or CROOK Act. You have to give it to the congressional staff who come up with the names for these legislative vehicles. It's great. The establishment of the bipartisan congressional caucus against foreign corruption and kleptocracy demonstrates the fact that concern around corruption stretches across the political spectrum and is genuinely seen as a national security issue. Of course, more needs to be done, and gray legal areas or loopholes still exist in the US and in many countries that facilitate corrupt behavior and structures. In addition, laws are not enough to address the challenges of kleptocracy. We need the right tools, relationships, and partnerships to make meaningful progress. As I said, this was the key motivation behind the establishment of IFES's new center. National institutions and non-governmental organizations are key partners in these efforts. And that is why we are delighted to have partners joining us from all over the world for the discussion today. In the coming weeks and months, under our new center, we hope to announce a range of new partnerships and initiatives with diverse national and international partners. These are not partnerships for partnerships' sake, but genuine efforts to look at pervasive corruption problems from new angles and with new tools. In addition, our new center will launch a non-resident scholars and fellows program to leverage the best academic and practitioner talent and research to further our mission and to engage non-traditional partners. On the subject of partners, I'm very grateful to Gary Kalman from Transparency International and Paul Massaro from the Helsinki Commission for joining us as panelists today. Gary and Paul and their two organizations are leading voices in the fight against corruption around the world, and IFES is genuinely grateful and honored to work alongside them. But before we turn to our great panelists for today's discussion, we'd like to play a brief video introducing the new Center for Anti-Corruption and Democratic Trust and outlining its mission.
Thank you, Tony. And given the long delay, let's jump right in if Paul and Gary don't mind. And I'm interested to hear, as the first question, what US legislative innovation are you most excited about that has the potential to benefit other countries struggling with corruption or kleptocracy, or that might be replicable in other countries? And maybe, Paul, if I can turn to you first.
Yeah, for sure. So excited to be here. Wonderful organization, and so glad you're doing more work on this and really focusing on this issue. I mean, for me, the fight against corruption is the issue. I mean, it's the existential challenge faced by democracy in the 21st century. It is the organizing principle of authoritarian regimes. So it's really important that we focus on this problem and think about how we're going to fight it. And I think about it from sort of the perspective of three pillars, the sort of three pillars of counter-kleptocracy, I call them sometimes, or Paul's pillars. But in any case, the first pillar is cleaning up our act at home, which we really have to acknowledge that Western enablers in the Western financial system makes kleptocracy possible. It takes two to tango. There aren't just kleptocrats, there's kleptocrats and enablers. You need both. The second is disabling corrupt networks, which is actually targeting the kleptocrats themselves and breaking down their networks, blocking them from our shores and financial systems and ensuring that they can't act, or even better, putting them in jail. And then finally is promoting the rule of law abroad, which is very important. That's sort of attacking corruption at the source. We've been trying to do that for a very long time. I really think that that's maybe IFES's even primary mission is developing democracy, developing effective electoral systems, and in fighting for the rule of law around the world. And yet we're 30 years after the Cold War, and it seems like, democracy is very much on the defensive at the moment as autocracy rises. So why did that happen? And to me, the answer is, of course, very clear. It is global corruption. And it is the way that the transnational financial sort of sphere system works, and moves. You steal it abroad and you spend it in the West. So you need to be attacking all three of these things at the same time. So I want to talk about a financial or a legislative innovation in each of these pillars really quick, and then pass it off to Gary to talk about perhaps some of the good work that we got done last Congress and that he's paying attention to as the executive branch implements it. But right now, cleaning up our act at home. Last Congress, we abolished anonymous shell companies, very difficult thing. And I want Gary to talk, Gary will talk more about that because he was really the tip of the spear on all that action. But the next great reform we need at home is basic due diligence reform for gatekeepers. So the only gatekeeping professionals, that is to say lawyers, lobbyists, accountants, all those who provide access to the American financial and legal and political system. The only ones of those that have to do any due diligence whatsoever are banks. They have to ask about the source of funds. Nobody else does. So we want to give Treasury the power to be able to create rules that require this due diligence of others. And this is called the Enablers Act. This is an acronym, if you can believe it. It's the Establishing New Authorities for Business, Laundering, and Enabling Risks to Security Act. So that's in that first pillar, cleaning up our act at home. The second pillar, in disabling networks, one of our legislative innovations I'm very excited about, is the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, which is in fact unbelievably sponsored by both the chamber, or endorsed by both the Chamber of Commerce and Greenpeace, which is a very unlikely combo, but there it is. So it kind of shows you the way that this issue is so bipartisan and all across the political spectrum, the support for it, because it really is. There's really nothing more American than fighting corruption like this. And what this bill would do is it would criminalize the demand side of bribery. So of course, many people are familiar with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which makes it illegal for a U.S. corporation to pay a bribe abroad, but it is not illegal for someone to demand a bribe of that corporation. And that's what we want to do, because the way that corruption works, of course, is that these kleptocrats abroad they abuse their power to collect money, but then they don't spend it there, right? They spend it in the West. They come back to the West. They buy houses in the Riviera or Miami or whatever. So this is actually, if we have this in place, it gives us an excellent hook, a jurisdictional nexus from which to go after these guys. And actually, I do the ideal, which is not sanctions or visa bans, which are excellent things we do. But the ideal is always arrest them and try them for their crimes, because these are crimes they're committing, And finally, in the promoting the rule of law abroad pillar, I want to talk about the Combating Global Corruption Act, a very exciting initiative, which will mandate State Department reporting on every single country according to their compliance with international anti-corruption norms and standards, and in fact tier them into sort of three rankings. That is the first tier of, okay, you're working to be compliant. Second tier, you're not really working. Third tier, you're completely out of compliance. And then if you're in that third tier, your leadership. not the people, because that we understand these are victims of kleptocracy really, but the leadership of this country, the political leadership, will be evaluated for global Magnitsky sanctions. That is to say, we're saying, if you're not doing anything to be compliant with anti-corruption norms and standards, then we don't want you to have access to our financial system. We don't want you to have access to our shores. Remember, sanctions are defensive in that nature. That's us saying, it's a privilege to have access to the United States. It is not a right for these individuals. So those are 3 initiatives. There's in fact 13 that we're moving through Congress at the moment, but I'll leave it there because those are 3 very exciting ones, and I think they fit well into those 3 pillars.
Perfect. Well, good luck getting them all done by Christmas, Paul.
Yeah.
And for those on the line who are IFES staff members or partners, they will tell you that we love our acronyms. So well done on enablers. But Gary, same question to you. What legislative innovation sort of excites you most that you've been involved in?
Sure, and thanks for inviting me here, and really appreciate the work you all do and to be presenting here today. I guess what I would like to focus on is, as Paul referred to, is the Corporate Transparency Act that passed January of this year. And let me start by saying that just prior to this webinar, I was on another session that was internal to Transparency International, and over 60 chapters from countries around the world were on that webinar, and we were talking about the Summit for Democracy and moving things forward. And one of the things that we talked about was the Corporate Transparency Act. And let me explain why I think this is, it is an important development that we all need to pay attention to. Anonymous companies have been used by kleptocrats and other criminals for years. It is, as I think Global Witness referred to it, the getaway car for kleptocrats. The UN and the World Bank, through their STAR initiative, did a study and found that 70% of grand corruption cases used anonymous corporate vehicles to stash and hide money in various places. And Paul's right. It's sort of almost ironic that people are stealing money from non-rule of law countries, but they are hiding it in rule of law countries because they want the money to be protected. Now, let's be clear that money is not going into China and into Russia and into Sudan and North Korea. Money is coming out of those places, and it is finding its way into Europe, Canada, and the United States. So we know that one of the hardest things to figure out in the United States is who owns these companies that are involved in the nefarious activity. There was a study done by professors out of the UT Austin, University of Texas in Austin, and a couple of other professors that sent out thousands of emails saying, we want to set up a company, and it had all these red flags in it without crossing the line. But clearly it was dirty money. And in fact, in one of my favorite stories, to give you an example of how this stuff works, a corporate formation agent in Florida wrote back saying, this is clearly dirty money, could even be terror financing. I won't touch it for less than $5,000 a month. Now, what's scary about that is not that there's bad guys in the world. We know that there's bad actors in the world. That's not surprising. What is surprising is, had that person not written that email and just said, sure, I'll do it, but it's going to cost you $5,000 a month, he would have done nothing wrong. And if that had actually been terror financing, he would have helped them get it and move it through the United States through anonymous companies. So let me just say that the Corporate Transparency Act, for the first time in US history, will require, when a company is formed, to name the actual true owner who owns and controls the company. This may seem like a simple thing. Honest businesses already do this, but they're not actually required to do it. They're just required to put a contact on the form. But the average, plumber, electrician, what have you, puts their own name on the form because they're filling it out and filing it themselves. Bad guys hire agents, lawyers, accountants, what have you, to do it on their behalf. So we're going to collect this information. The good news is that this is becoming a global norm. There's 110 countries that have now made commitments to create beneficial ownership transparency and registers. The Financial Action Task Force, which is the international anti-money laundering standard setting body, which the US belongs, has now put forth a draft updated the recommendation on beneficial ownership transparency, strengthening it, recognizing that it is in fact what I refer to as a foundational reform. And let me just say this and then I'll stop and we can move on. But we can increase resources to law enforcement. We can, give them more money to do investigations. We could do better information sharing of data across international lines. We could improve the mutual legal assistance process to make sure that potential evidence is being shared more quickly and more efficiently. But unless we know who is behind these companies, law enforcement continues to tell us they will hit a dead end and they have to drop the case. So it is not the only thing we need to do. The things that Paul is now talking about, we need to do those as well. But without doing this, none of that would matter. So it is a very exciting development. It is happening around the world, and we need to encourage this development in order to make serious progress against corruption.
Thank you, Gary. And it strikes me listening to both you and Paul, how important the connection is between what we're doing in one country and then what we are doing at home. And I think often, as Paul said, promoting the rule of law and democracy abroad is just a core mission of IFES, but often we don't connect enough with what's going on domestically in the US and how important the global norms are, not just to apply in a particular country we're focused in, but of course in these other countries where the getaway cars are, as you say. So we've talked about some of the innovations that you're most excited about. What is still to be done? And Paul, I know you touched on sort of one thing, but what else would you like to see put in place or expanded further, and why? Perhaps, Gary, did you want to go first on this one?
Sure. I think the most important thing we need to do, if you're looking at these sets of issues, is implementation and enforcement. I said 110 countries have pledged to implement beneficial ownership registries. Only about 40 have done so. But even more importantly, is the issue of enforcement. There's a lot of countries around the world that have terrific laws. Nigeria has, I think, 9 or 10 different anti-corruption agencies. Every time there's a scandal, they create a new agency. I don't think anybody would now argue that Nigeria is a completely corruption-free country. But even looking to the Western countries in Europe, they have terrific laws. They actually have many of the laws in place that Paul was talking about. They have due diligence requirements for investment advisors. They have them for accountants. They have them for a number of but they don't enforce the law. And when we talk about, Paul touched on anti-bribery laws, right? So we have a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Other countries have both an anti-bribery law that punishes the demand side as well as the offering side of bribes. But when TI did a study of 47 countries looking at those laws, we found that only 4 were actively enforcing them. In fact, if you take out the 4 that were actively enforcing and the 4-year period between 2016 and 2020 that we looked at, the median number of investigations started on anti-bribery in the remaining 43 countries, the median number of cases was 0. So we have an enforcement problem. Some of it is political will, no doubt. But to just brush it off all as political will, I think is lazy and is also inaccurate and harmful to us as we move forward. Some of it is issues of money, and if you separate that out, some of that is political will, but not all of it. In the United States, we have a commitment to this stuff, but our financial intelligence unit, which is our sort of at Treasury Department, it's the entity that's supposed to monitor the U.S. financial system and protect against illicit finance. It's the same size as Australia's. Now, just to put in comparison, our economy is 10 times the size, and we are the world's reserve currency and therefore monitoring global finance. And we have the same number of people to do that that Australia thinks it needs to monitor its $2 trillion economy. It's either Australia is way overstaffed, which I don't think anybody thinks, or the US is woefully inadequate. So some of it is money, some of it is international cooperation. Paul talked about information sharing. We have a law in this country right now that allows Treasury to set up a cross-border payments database so we can track illicit funds moving across borders. That's been in place since 2010. We haven't done it yet. And the reason is that we need to set up an international dialogue to work with our partners to set up that transfer of information. So there's international cooperation, there's funding issues, there's a series of other issues that we could take a look at that go beyond political will that we could make progress on if we were to prioritize this. So if I could wish for something, I would put it on enforcement.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. And of course, the other piece of enforcement is public visibility that something is being done. And we had a stakeholder today saying you might have a corruption prevention action here where you saved a lot of money for the state budget, but it won't get the same attention than someone being thrown in jail. And of course, the deterrence factor that has. And certainly in the election sphere, the lack of enforcement for electoral corruption just repeats that cycle as the public sees a lack of deterrence once the election is actually over. Paul, what about you? What would you most like to see be put in place or expanded further?
Right, so you mentioned the caucus against foreign corruption and kleptocracy, and that would be my great wish, is to see other parliaments, other legislatures create similar and to develop a kind of interparliamentary alliance against kleptocracy. I mean, there are models for this, such as the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. And I guess, you'd said public visibility, and so a caucus serves two purposes, right? I mean, like a working group or just having members that are very interested in this topic and some, staffing capacity and some institutionalization of the national security threat of corruption. Because on the one hand, it provides an automatic outlet for all these bills and an ability to get the work done and a workflow and have it streamlined. And it's funny, you don't want it to grow too big. Of course, we're at no threat of that at the moment. But you need something, like you need some institutionalization in order to have an outlet for the ideas, in order to have an engine for the ideas. And this caucus, we have 13 bills, right? I mean, we're pushing this forward. This caucus is a few months old, so I mean, it's really, I think, important to recognize how new perceiving corruption as a national security threat is. I mean, I've been at this for about 8 years now. Gary's been at it for a little bit longer than that. And, we've been working together on a lot of these issues. And I mean, it is a sea change over the last few years to see the way that Republicans and Democrats are perceiving corruption in the same way, to view how corruption has come to be seen as, the tool of authoritarian regimes, as the inside track to influence the United States and our allies and so on and so forth. That wasn't the case even just a few years ago. I mean, even just a few years ago in whatever, 2015 or whatever, I'd walk into a room of national security professionals and I'd say corruption is a national security threat. And they'd be like, what are you talking about? What about terrorism? What about nukes or kinetic warfare? And this is the kind of thing that would happen, right? I mean, and now you walk in and people are like, corruption is a national security threat. Well, thank you very much, Captain Obvious. And I mean, what a win that is, right? What a win that is for us, that our issue is now at the top tier. And in fact, we've had the president come out and say that corruption is a national security threat. And we've got this, national security study memorandum one that, declaring countering corruption as a core national security interest. And we expect whatever report will come out of that as to what the executive branch is going to do this December. But I really think that, even a day before that declaration was made, we announced our caucus. So Article 1 beat Article 2 by just 24 hours. But in any case, I do think that the institutionalization of this, let's not let this be a fleeting moment of recognition, right? I mean, the corruption is such a threat precisely because it is opaque and corrosive and it destroys you over the long term. It's not like terrorism in that sense. It doesn't explode. It doesn't suddenly become sensational and demand immediate action and live in the minds of every American. I mean, it's something that, you wake up one day and it's been going on for 10, 20 years and democracy's gone. The rule of law is gone. It destroyed it from the inside. So we have this moment right now, and this is the moment where we need to jump on it, institutionalize it, get caucuses, expand the caucus as far as possible, get caucuses all over the world. And parliaments are the best place to do this, because parliament is where, or legislatures really, that's where innovation happens. It's not executive branches, it's not governments. Those are more status quo. They're tied into all the elite circles around the world. Oftentimes they're tied into corrupt elites in other countries and so on and so forth. And that's just, by the manner of traditional diplomacy or whatever, so it's really in the legislatures, and it's always been. I mean, American human rights and anti-corruption policy has always been driven by Congress, always, and I mean, really, when you look at the Helsinki Commission where I work, I mean, we were founded, to push the executive branch on its human rights commitments. So now we're pushing the executive branch and other governments and all democratic governments really on our ideals and our commitment to anti-corruption.
Thank you, Paul. So now that we've taken 10 years or more to get corruption on the agenda, at the top of the agenda, how do we know we're being successful? How do we know that we're taking on kleptocrats and actually winning? What's an effective measure of success? And maybe, Paul, you want to continue and then pass on to Gary.
Sure. So I think, Gary and I, and really the whole community speaks about this a whole lot, because there's always, in the diplomatic sense and in sort of traditional national security sense, there's always this idea of behavioral change, that if you haven't changed another country's behavior, then what was the point? But I mean, I really think that we need to have, again, accompanying our sea change to viewing corruption as a national security threat and counter-kleptocracy as US grand strategy. And what is the United States about? It's about, not being a hub of dirty money, and it's like, it's in one sense, it's really core ideals kind of stuff. It's is it really that much to ask that we not be complicit, in the horrible human rights abuse and theft that goes on around the world, right? We're not even asking that we change over there. We're just asking that we not allow them here, right? So, I mean, it's in that sense, I think that we should be viewing it more as sanctions, law enforcement, these things are good in and of themselves. We should recognize that the more we do, the better, because just by virtue of having oligarchs on our sanctions list, just by virtue of pursuing law enforcement action, and so on and so forth, this is blocking these individuals from our economy. It's blocking them from our shores and financial system, and it's making us safer. And it's, providing sort of a measure of justice for the victims of kleptocracy in the world that have been denied it, right? Because they live, in these systems in which their leaders enjoy total impunity, and in which the very little bits of rule of law says, because every leader, every powerful person does need some, dose of the rule of law, some amount, some ounce, because they do need to protect their stolen money, and they do need to, sue their cousins and divorce their wives and all that kinds of stuff, but they've been able to totally outsource that need to the West, right? That's why you have all of the, Nazarbayev suits or whatever going on in London courts, Russian suits going on in London courts, and so on and so forth. They've just completely outsourced their need for it. So we block these individuals, we force them to need it at home, right? And at the end of the day, not only does that protect us, it keeps them out, it shows that we're consistent with our ideals, but it also, in the long term, means that the elites of these countries finally need to develop the rule of law at home, right? Because they can no longer outsource it. So you start getting Ukrainian oligarchs or Russian oligarchs or whatever thinking about, oh crap, this system really isn't actually working for us anymore, because it used to be I could just loot, and then I could hold the money abroad and be protected. Well, now I can't. Now it's susceptible to theft at home, which means that we need the rule of law at home because I need to protect my stolen money. So I mean, that's, and at the end of the day, I mean, it's funny. It's almost a cynical theory of the rule of law. I mean, I'm an optimist, but I mean, it's the thought of how does it emerge in the first place? Well, the powerful need to protect their stuff. And then eventually you open up the courts and you open up the system to everybody. And then before too long, even the most vulnerable among us can protect themselves via the court system. And that's what you get, but so long as we allow full access to these individuals to the West, it'll never happen. And they'll just keep looting, they'll keep undermining our system. So to me, that's the measure. So the measure is really, the measure is really one of like, how many oligarchs are we sanctioning? How many oligarchs are we banning? How many, you know, big cases are we building against these individuals?
Well, I'm an optimist and a pragmatist too. And I like to focus on justice for the individual as much as justice in the system itself. And, you know, targeting both of those, I think is critical. Gary.
Yeah, I'm actually going to follow up on what you just said. And I'm probably going to be a little bit more granular. Paul is a little bit more big picture, which I always appreciate. You know, when we say, oh, you know, people go, oh, anti-corruption rules are just not working. And my argument would be not working for who? Because I understand that, you know, there's these studies that talk about $1 trillion in illicit cash sloshing around the globe. You know, I remember somebody saying, you know, we collect 0.1%, you know, we actually able to capture 0.1% of that. This was years ago. We do a little bit better now. And therefore, quote unquote, we're a decimal point away from complete and utter failure. That is one way of looking at it, and that's pretty sad, right? On the flip side, you know, if you take a look at what has been recovered and returned, and we don't do a great job at returning, but to the extent that we do, the amounts of money we're talking about are quite meaningful, right? We talk about trillions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, you know, et cetera, et cetera. I remember reading a study from ActionAid a number of years ago that one company was using anonymous structures and other sort of ways to dodge taxes of $27 million, which in the United States, we like barely think about when we talk about global government and we talk about governance. And yet the health minister that was from Ghana, and the health minister of Ghana said, you know, with that 27 million, we could get rid of malaria in Ghana, right? We talk about, you know, there was a recent thing about, you know, $10 billion was recovered from, you know, various schemes and what have you, but it's only $10 billion. There were hundreds of billions of dollars that were stolen. For $10 billion, we could vaccinate all of sub-Saharan Africa. So to me, when you talk about how do you help the individual, right? How do we make sure that lives are getting better in the places that are suffering under these kleptocratic regimes? That's what I'm looking for. Are we able to actually get some money and put it back into a system that will help those people move forward? Things have gotten so bad, for example, that in one country, I was on a phone call recently in one country that was applying for a loan from the International Monetary Fund. And the advocates in the country and some advocates that were basically from the country, but in the diaspora, were arguing with the IMF. They were on a call and I was invited to, saying, please don't give the loan. Because not only is it going to get stolen, but now the citizens are going to be on the hook for even greater debt that they can't pay for, right? And so if you give any aid to this country, have conditions. Literally somebody said, require that in order to get any more money, that the first thing is they have to sell the 2 yachts that they own. The 2 yachts would raise about $60 million, and that would have provided healthcare and COVID response money. This was a while ago, so it was before the vaccine, but it would have provided, you know, masks and PPE and all this kind of stuff to everyone in the country. So I guess I look at it, I think Paul's totally right to look at it in the broader picture, but I also think that we need to not take a look at, oh, you know, in our view, this is small amounts of money, but what is it actually doing? Are we actually making lives better for the people that are suffering under these regimes? And I think that the answer is still mixed, so I don't want to be Pollyannish about it. But the more that we are doing some of it and we need to do more, we need to, as we seize this money, we need to be able to figure a way to get it back into these countries in a way that benefits the people. And I think that's just a political will question. And we need to do it. We need to do it more. But I do think that there are there is evidence that this is moving. Let me say one other thing and I'll stop, is in the Pandora Papers, just because that just came out and that was the big story, right? And this is a little bit embarrassing to the United States. Jersey, which is one of those island nations that is usually referred to as a tax haven and a secrecy jurisdiction and all of that, because they created a beneficial ownership directory required by the UK government, literally a Brazilian millionaire moved his assets from Jersey to South Dakota. Literally moved it out of what is we see as an island tax haven, stereotypical nation to the United States because of that law. So when we implement our law, we're going to chase them and continue to chase them and chase them and chase them and get into the situation that Paul is talking about, where they run out of places to go, where there's rule of law and protected places able to protect their assets. So I do think that we are making progress. I think this moment is a sea change from where we were 10 or 15 years ago. And while there's a long way to go, there's reason for optimism.
Thank you, Gary. I am conscious we are at time, so and I want to stick to time, knowing that people have to jump to other things. We were going to have some interesting discussions, I think, about some, concerning trends around elections and some of those threats. So perhaps at some point I'll get the generosity of Gary and Paul to bring them back for a smoother discussion. But maybe do you each want to end sort of in 30 seconds, particularly any advice for some of the audience out there? Some are from very small countries, perhaps that don't have the sort of influence with the US to influence sanctions regimes or international cooperation. Advice to just advocates and partners in our audience around the world. Paul, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. So I guess just very briefly, I kind of want to reiterate what I said at the top, that this is it. This is when we ask ourselves why did democracy fail to win out in the last 30 years? Why is the post-Cold War ended up seeing the rise of techno surveillance corrupt dictatorship rather than liberal democracy? This is the reason. This is it. It's global corruption. It's the ability to steal in these countries and then hide all that money abroad and co-opt enormous amounts of legions of Western professionals and even sometimes political parties to do your bidding. So this is what we're dealing with. So my message is, don't give up. You're on the right track. Remain optimistic about it. Scream at the top of your lungs about it. Recognize that it is transnational, that it's not something unique to a particular country, that this is not some developing world phenomenon or developed world phenomenon, that this is all about the global corrupt networks that we're breaking apart. And I think that, for example, the international consortium of investigative journalists and other journalists, OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, and many others have done an extremely good job networking themselves to fight networks. This is a battle of networks, right? The criminals, the kleptocrats, are exceptional at networks because they all make money off it, right? They don't even have to like one another. They don't have to deal with ideology or whatever. They're just all making a bunch of money, right? So what we need to do is recognize that this is a big problem and build networks ourselves. So reach out to me, reach out to Gary, volunteering him, but whoever, right? It's IFES is doing a good job of this, I think, but it's about building these massive transnational networks for rule of law to counter the massive transnational networks that drive corruption. And that's it. When we think about what we're in, used to be the hermetically sealed capitalist system versus the hermetically sealed communist system, and they did very different battlegrounds. Now it is the two transnational networks that are competing against one another. And I won't deny it. I think the corrupt one has the upper hand and has had the upper hand for the last 30 years. But we're getting there. We definitely are, and the narrative is changing.
Great. And Gary, last word from you.
Sure, sort of quickly, but just again, going to some specific things. I think that as Paul talks about the changing narrative, that if you and your country, can make progress with the people that are in power, great. If not, which is what I think you're asking, where do you turn to help and for help? And I think that there are a number, like this conversation I had with the IMF and the advocates, right? I think the International Monetary Fund is now for the first time, seriously, they've talked about corruption for years, but in the last year we saw a sea change. For example, COVID loans that were going out at the early part of the pandemic were, anti-corruption measures were, sort of couched with to the best of your ability or as practicable, which means that you could blow them off. When you start looking at September, October loans, more down the road where pressure had been built, you start seeing you must do this, create transparency of contracts and get audits and agree to all these things, or that's going to figure into any future loans you may apply for. There's a punishment there. They're willing to hold people accountable. I think the US government for a long time and still is sort of going through what I hope is a positive transformation from focusing a little too much, if you will, in my humble opinion, on US goals and how it puts money into various countries to starting to think about anti-corruption in those countries because corruption itself is corroding, US national security interests. And so there's an opportunity to talk to USAID. I think Samantha Power, the administrator, is serious about this, and she's got a staff of people working on an anti-corruption initiative that there's going to be new money and resources to help foster democratic institutions and fight corruption. The last thing I will say is, and we're seeing this in the Summit for Democracy, which has its struggles, but one of the good things is that the embassies have been charged with trying to help advocates and journalists and what have you pressure local governments into making better commitments around anti-corruption and other issues. So please use the embassies. And yes, I'm happy to reach out to me if you have questions, because the State Department said that they would be willing to facilitate those relationships and connections personally and country by country if necessary. So I think that there are levers that probably you went to before that were not helpful and ignored your pleas that now might be more sympathetic because the narrative has changed and the threat is being seen as much larger. So thank you for your work.
Well, thank you, Gary. Thank you, Paul. We really admire the work you've been doing, what you've been able to achieve. Really excited to be able to talk at this kind of moment or sea change, as you said, Gary. And everyone who's managed to stay on long enough got to hear the offer from both Paul and Gary to connect. So thank you again for your time. Sincere apologies for our technical difficulties, but I look forward to a follow-on discussion. And thank you all for joining.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.